Welcome to iNN's Headlines and Beyond for Thursday, March 22nd. And we're going to begin off just a little adjustment that Fridays from now on there won't be any news broadcast. Let me just make it. There won't be any news broadcasts because uh, typically the weekend's coming up and things really slow down. Today was a little slow, but I was also looking at some other new sources that I'm sort of cultivating, and I'm hoping to really bring forward some new stuff for next week that weren't in the news, sort of really pushing things forward and getting information out that really hasn't been seen, really hasn't been talked about on a lot of the mainstream media. And this is the sort of stuff that sort of may seem innocuous or insignificant, but really does have an impact. I mean, what you need to understand is policy has an effect on the ground, a real effect on the ground. And the decisions we need to, when we decide who we're going to elect or how we're going to support things and making these decisions, we need to understand how policy actually works out on the ground. And there's two different types of policy. There's foreign policy and then there's domestic policy. In the first part of the show, we were always going to start covering domestic policy. We're going to leave the foreign policy to the last half of the show. If the domestic policy takes too much time and takes up the first half hour, then the foreign policy will take up the last half hour, or how much ever time it takes up. So this is the format that we'll be going into. And so let's begin now with the U.S. domestic policy. And we're now looking at the primaries. And every time you go look at the primaries, they're talking about the battle between Romney, Rick Santorum, Gingrich, and Ron Paul for the nominee as president. What a lot of times they don't sort of get into, although you can find other reports as you go more local, or if you look at the between-hour broadcasts, you'll find these what they call interest pieces, and these are pieces are sort of they're kind of air fillers and not really put out there with any degree of significance. But sometimes you can really find some good nuggets in there that if you start digging a little bit more, you can find something that connects to domestic policy and that should be on the platforms of the candidates that are up there and sort of really need to be brought forward. A lot of time you hear Gingrich talking about Obama's tax and spend liberals, but you can't just say tax and spend liberals. You have to start putting some reality behind it. And unfortunately, a large chunk of the mainstream media, when they start getting into this, really don't get into a large chunk of the details. And it really depends on what you're watching, whether you're watching Fox or you're watching CNN or something else that's more left-leaning. Fox, I saw some of it, but the thing is, the candidates themselves need to start bringing up some more concrete issues, not simply talking about what it's like on the campaign trail, but actually really start bringing up some concrete issues. And this is what I'm seeing so far lacking in the mainstream media, is that when they talk about the primaries and the campaigns, they're not really talking about any substantive issues. They're not talking about what's actually happening with the pipeline, the oil pipeline that supposedly was stopped and now it's starting again for something, or it's not starting. But if you dig into the pipeline, this oil pipeline has had this huge controversy, and Obama says he's all for the pipeline, and he says, well, it's not my fault that the EPA shuts shut the pipeline down in certain parts. And what you'll see is that you'll see that, and this is the insanity. This is the insanity of government policy and government in business. Because of an election year, they're building the pipeline from Texas to Oklahoma. The problem is that pipeline doesn't really go anywhere in Oklahoma because it needs to go up to the Canadian border. And the problem is, between Oklahoma and the Canadian border, that pipeline has been shut down by the EPA. And the EPA is, in all these different agencies that Obama created, now have their own sub rules and have made these made putting a line putting in a pipeline, or actually not just simply putting in the pipeline. The pipeline is sort of just an example of what's going on. That it's so complex, not even the president can resolve the problems. These problems are now beyond the president's capacity to resolve them. There's so many rules and regulations in there. And this is going to affect a lot of people because they're building this pipe to nowhere. They're getting federal funding for it, which means that's going to have to be paid for somehow. Yeah, so these people have temporary jobs, but at some point in time and later, the Obama said this. He's going to start taxing it back. And they always say, oh, we're not going to tax the average person. We're going to tax just the rich. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Because the rich and a large chunk of the people who are in the upper tax brackets, who have the money, are the people who create jobs. And there's no haggling about this because they're the ones who start. They're the ones who create, the small business. They're the ones who build the factories. And right now, if you talk to anyone about building factories, who's going to build a factory, put in that time to build the factory, and go through all the regulatory complications? I mean, to build a factory, if you're a business person, you're going to want to build a factory. You have to hire an entire staff just to deal with the regulatory compliance. These would be the lawyers, and then you have to contract out for all of the requirements under these. And this is not just to get this is not to get the factory built. This is just talking about the environmental studies, all the studies that have to be done. And these studies are not exempt for any company. Even if you want to start up a bread and breakfast, and was watching this on Fox News about this couple who wanted to set up a bed and breakfast. The problem was the legal complications were so complicated. Even the legal complications were as such that they couldn't get past the red tape to open up the business, so they didn't. So this house is now sitting empty. And so we see where people are having economic problems. We see that the government is creating this economic problems. But then they'll come on the other. Here's where they'll come on the other side now, on the local side of things, and this is where you have these these sort of Orwellian, draconian counselors who are much like the Democrats up at the federal level. They're basically of the same mind. These people in government who their primary job is to be in government, they have no other livelihood. These are people who are control freaks. These people want to control everything. They're basically, and I'm not going to sugarcoat, they're mini Hitlers. And they will, for their own interest, jail people, fine people, even when they don't have a penny to their name, or even when they're having a hard time making their mortgage payments. They don't care. And the police, who are the dogs of these these politicians, these fascists, will happily do what their master tells them to do. And so the police are not there to protect us. They're not there to protect and serve the public in terms of our constitutional rights. They are the lapdogs and the hounds of the fascist politicians. And these include the fascist politicians, and this is going to start doing this. I'm going to start naming names. And I'm talking right now. I've got just the cities. I've got one city in Burnsville, Minnesota. And the other one is in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. Those two areas there, these politicians need to be removed. It's time for a regime change. And the way you do a regime change is if you see politicians behaving as such, Finding and jailing people. Now the newspapers haven't said that. I'm saying this because you're not going to see this in the mainstream newspaper. When you see a politician stepping over their bounds and they're fining people for not having siding on their house, for having not having the proper jobs to pay for the jobs if they want to start a construction job. Let's say you start a renovation job, you lose your job and you can't you can't continue paying for the renovation. The city can fine you and then send you to jail for 30 days. And this is what happens in Burnside. No, it's Burnsville. Burnsville, Minnesota. The guy, lost his job. He couldn't finish paying for his renovations, and so they ended up throwing him in jail for 30 days and fining him for it. I mean, when you see this, and this is sort of what happened in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, where a lady, her yard was messy because she was in the process of renovating her home. Her business began to fail. She couldn't continue the renovation. The city thought her yard was too messy, and they say they warned her, but knowing the cities and the way they lie and the type of people these people are in the cities, and including these police officers who are basically they're basically fascist. These are the same people you see on South Park, where you see Cartman saying "respect my authority." That's who these people are. There's no sugarcoating. If you just hear once or twice they're doing that, but if you hear it on the news over and over again, and I can find something just about every month coming out about something that the police have done, arresting people for spitting on the sidewalk or jaywalking or stupid things. I mean, just watch some of these cop shows and some of the. If you pay attention to some of the stuff that these people have been arrested for, what you see is you see this idiot who's got this badge throwing his weight around. This is people say this whole thing that's going on now in Florida about this guy Zimmerman who shot the teenager. I'm not going to. At this point in time, I'm not going to be putting any racial colors on things, so I'm going to say teenager and not say anything else. They're making it a racial issue, but it's not a racial issue. If you went on the internet and you saw what's going on in the police behavior and authority, and all you have to do is look and see what's going on and the enjoyment that people are getting from these shows like Operation Repo. People, when they have a sense of authority, will have a tendency, not all people, but there are a number of people who will, and it seems these people who do volunteer for these things, and in many cases go into these fields, have this ideal and this behavior that they're looking for the respect of authority. And then they assume, when they get this authority, they assume that respect. And this is sort of where Cartman comes off with the Southern cop, the hit cop, where respect my authority. I mean, if you're a police officer and you're watching this, or a military officer and you're watching this, because I saw on CNN tonight about how they have this new military officer on CNN describing what happened in Afghanistan and what's happening to the soldier who's being charged now for murder. And I wouldn't put it past CNN, because I know CNN's done stuff like this before, that this person might be some sort of CIA agent. I think there's something going further on behind the scenes with the Zimmerman character than people with what's going on in Afghanistan than people are sort of letting on. Justifying, saying that when you're given an order in combat, that as a soldier your duty is to your superior officer, it's not to the United States. But that's not true. See, all you have to do is sit down and read the Constitution and find out that this is not the case. I mean, this is what the whole purpose of the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, is all about. This. It's about letting the government know that there is a boundary. And once the government steps over this boundary beyond the constitutional limits, no soldier has the obligation to follow the orders of a superior when this action is outside the bounds of the Constitution. As a matter of fact, the Constitution goes so far as to state with the militias that if the government steps beyond its bounds, or the superior steps beyond its bounds, that you can revolt against this person. This is why the militia was set up. The militia was specifically set up to spread out and this is why the Second Amendment is so important, and why the Socialist Democrats want to get rid of it. Is that the founding fathers knew and understood the only way to prevent a police state is to keep its citizens armed. This is the point of view. This is the purpose of the Second Amendment: is to prevent a police state from happening, because you have people who are armed. And the Social Democrats know this. And this is why you see now on the lines of Florida, you have the Democrats lining up against the gun law, and you have the Republicans and a large chunk of the NRA supporting it. It's basically now come down. This person's death is not important anymore. It doesn't matter that this guy died, this teen died. What matters is that you have the gun control law. You have both sides queuing up on either side of it, and then you have the various different black groups, the so-called civil liberty groups, these so-called civil liberties groups, campaigning, and it's become their political platform. It has nothing to do now with this teen's death. It has all to do with politics, and this is something that's so unfortunate in our society, that we can't simply have something simply be a tragedy. There has to be always politicians lining up on either side of the thing. But it also it goes back to when looking at Zimmerman, that this isn't a color thing. If you understand what's been going on with law enforcement for the last few years, and what you see at the airports with the TSA, and a number of other reports that are coming across the internet as you go through the internet and sort of find these videos of cops beating up people. We saw in New Orleans that cops shot people in the back. We saw them beating people up. And then turning around and blaming it on them. We've seen the police department and their brutality, not against any particular cop, but everybody. We've even seen it. The cop on the news in this bar beating up the female bartender. It has nothing to do with race. It has to do with expectations and this sense of authority that these people have. And it's wrong. We're instead of, and then I've seen this with some of my friends who have become police officers. The primary training is not management of what's wrong in society today. It's paramilitary training. So what we're training today in terms of police, we're not training standard police out. We're doing paramilitary training. We have paramilitary police officers out there now. So the paramilitary police officers don't know how to diffuse the situation and bring it back to something more neutral. Their first instinct is to inflame the situation and push it over. They come in with this position of intimidation to strike fear in the person. Well, if this person is going off the edge and has a gun, and your approach is to knock more fear into this guy, you're not going to diffuse the situation. You're going to inflame it. And it's either going to result in the person getting killed, which it usually happens, or a police officer being killed. And the thing is that nobody benefits from this. But again, you have people who are in political positions who have political ideas, who want these policies followed because it's their baby, and this is the way they think, and because these people are, again, controlling fascists, they want things the way they want things, and that's about it. And they're not willing to listen to anybody else, and to what anybody else has to say. And the only way to get rid of these people is to make this an issue in the elections, to keep this as an issue in the election. And here's what you do: anytime you see somebody getting arrested for something stupid, you see it in your paper, you look up and see who your representative is on the city council, or if it's a state law issue, look who are there for the state. Look at their voting record, and if they voted for that law or didn't stand up and say anything about that law, toss them out the next election. You have to start using your vote to get rid of these fascists who have taken over government. And if you don't do that, at some point in time, this government's going to turn on you. And this is what I'm saying. Is I'm going to go in. I'm going to start looking at these local stories. I'm going to look for these fascist councils. I'm going to name the cities, like now the two cities that I'm going to name today, have these fascist councils. These are Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, and Burnsville, Minnesota. Both of these places have fascist councils. They have judges on the bench who enforce these rules, who have dishonored the name of justice and have dishonored the bench and jurisprudence. They have dishonored and gone against the sensibilities on how people can be charged in terms of the crime must fit the punishment, in terms of that's the constitutionality of it. They've gone against this constitutionality in order to appease the people who are paying their salaries. That's particularly the politicians. Even though the judge is supposed to be independent, but is not. This goes for the police, who are supposed to not protect the politicians, but protect the citizen. If you're a police officer and you are protecting this, you are not protecting the rights of the citizen, you're a fascist, and you are doing a disservice not only to your badge, but you're doing a disservice to the flag of the country. You're spitting and burning the flag of the United States. There is no difference between somebody who violates the Constitution, and I'm talking about people like Robert De Niro, these ignorant Hollywood actors who pretend to be human rights people but hide behind DCA and support censorship. If you act against the Constitution, you are a traitor. If you act in a manner that is fascist, then you are a fascist. It's as simple as that. If you don't want to be that, then you have, as an American, the right to stand up for your conscience and for your principles and say, no, I'm not going to do this. Imagine this, and take this as a scenario, and this is where I blame bureaucracy for a lot of the horrors we see in society. Let's say back in the beginning of World War II, or a little bit before World War II, we see a lot of what Hitler is doing is wrong. We see the beatings, we see all this stuff that's wrong. Imagine the civil service the bureaucracy set up and said, no, we're not going to do what we told you. Not one by one, en masse. Really said, we wouldn't be in the situation, we wouldn't have had Auschwitz, we wouldn't have had all those people dead. It was only because people couldn't stand up and say no to fascism that we ended up with what we ended up with. And this is sort of the same situation that's going on now in the United States. A lot of the poverty that we see in the United States, a lot of the people who can't make ends meet, who can't find a job because the government's standing in the way. It's people who believe they have such knowledge and understanding of what's going on that they refuse to deflate their own ego and allow people to work for themselves, to pull themselves out of the problem. And they're making the situation worse. And again, it has simply to do with ego. This whole thing is ego. This is why where you can have President Obama standing in a crowd in front of 5 people who were employed at the solar factory, this solar farm in Nevada, talking because only 5 people were employed there in this multi-million-dollar site that he spent millions of dollars, and saying to these people with a straight face, pretending there's a large crowd there of people who are employed there, that he supports green energy, and he's going to continue funding the research and development for this fantasy of green energy. He's going to continue supporting it, and he does this at the exact same time, with the exact same breath, that he goes out and charges China for supporting its solar industry, because it says it's dumping unfairly cheap solar panels on the U.S. Well, if the panels are cheaper and it's going to bring down the cost of electricity, then isn't this what you want? Or is it, do you want that? And this is what happened in Ontario. In order to bring in these alternative energies that are still fantasy, the government paid these people to set up these farms absurd amounts of money, simply handed out the cash, and then turned around and upped the prices of electricity, saying, "Oh, we need to pay the real cost of the price of electricity." That's not what happened. That's just this politician bullshit. What happened is that they spent way too much money. They spent a lot more than they can do, and now it's pushing the price of electricity up. As the price of electricity has gone up, it's pushed businesses out of business. It's pushed the food prices up in the supermarket, because every supermarket runs. You have to have electricity for your refrigerators and all, and the freezers, everything that goes on inside of a food store. They have a huge electric bill, and every time that electric bill goes up, the price gets passed on to you. When you pay for an item in the grocery store, you're paying for overhead. You're paying for the cost of the building. And that includes the cost of electricity, that includes the cost of energy, and all these other things. And if you've got regulation and government interference pushing these prices up, it's not inflation. This inflation isn't, oh, the economy is starting to pick up, so it's natural that we'll see this inflation. Bullshit. Most of these people who are talking about this have no idea where inflation comes from. Inflation is simply a magic thing that appears. And it's not a magic thing that appears. It's a calculable factor in economics. A large chunk of it is labor. A large chunk of inflation is labor. So if labor wants to know why you can never catch a break and you're always behind the 8 ball in terms of inflation, simple, because one of the major factors of inflation is your salary. If you're a mainline factory worker and you want a raise, well, guess what? They're going to raise the price of that product to cover your raise, right? Plus, they're going to tack on profit. So every time you get a raise, the price of whatever you're buying, whatever you're making, goes up. Your salary plus profit. So that's where inflation is. So you're never going to catch up with inflation. And even people in business know this. So what people in business do, rather than having one job, they have multiple jobs. This is where, if you're a bigger business person, you have multiple contracts. And as you bring in the multiple contracts, these contracts get you a little bit further and further ahead of inflation. Anyways, it's at the half-hour mark. We're going to now move on over to the second half. I will see you in a few minutes.